This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen. The case this week is a recommendation from one of our listeners, Kathleen Baxter. Thank you, Kathleen, for recommending this case.
Yes, thank you. And this week's case takes us to Springfield, Oregon, located in the southern Willamette Valley in Lane County, Oregon. It has a population of around 60,000. Matt Groening, who you may recognize as the creator of The Simpsons, is from Oregon, and it's widely speculated that he named the town in the show Springfield after Springfield, Oregon. And in Springfield, Oregon, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson, born August 7th, 1955 to Wesley and Willowdean Fredrickson. She is currently 66 years old. Diane claims that she didn't have a great childhood and was in fact molested by her father when she was younger. She graduated from Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, Arizona, and after high school, she went to Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College, but she was expelled after 1 year for promiscuity. After college, she returned to Arizona and married Steve Downs in 1973. Diane and Steve had 3 children during the time that they were married: Christie Ann in 1974, Cheryl Lynn in 1976, and Stephen Daniel, also known as Danny, in 1979. But Diane and Steve did not have a great marriage. Steve suspected that Diane was having an affair when she became pregnant with Danny, and he believed that Danny was not his child. So they divorced a year after Danny was born, and Diane continued to live in Arizona with her children. Diane had been dating a man named Robert Knickerbocker, but the issue with this relationship, other than the fact that it most likely began while Diane and Steve were married, was that Knickerbocker was also married. Diane ended up moving to Oregon, where she took a job as a postal worker and worked a route in Cottage Grove, Oregon. And she did this because she wanted to be closer to her parents. And that is how she arrived in Springfield, Oregon with her 3 children.
The case begins on the night of May 19th, 1983. 27-year-old Diane Downs drove to the emergency room in Springfield. Now, this was late at night. She came inside and told the staff that her kids had been shot. She said that the 3 kids were in the car. Now, this was Christie, who was 8, Cheryl, who was 7, and Danny was 3. All of them had been shot at close range. Cheryl, the 7-year-old, was already deceased. They began life-saving efforts on Christie and Danny. Now, Diane herself had also been shot. Her wound was to her left forearm, but it was not life-threatening. During treatment, Christie had a stroke, and she was considered in grave condition, and obviously she could not speak. The attending ER physician said he initially thought Christie was deceased. I mean, she was that bad off. Danny ended up being paralyzed. So the police are called, and they arrive at the hospital, and Diane tells them the story of what happened. She tells police she had taken the kids to a friend's home about 9:30, and they visited, and then they had begun the return trip back home, and it was dark. But she wanted to do some sightseeing because the kids had fallen asleep. She was driving on a rural road in Springfield when she was flagged down by a man with bushy hair. This man told her he wanted her car, and she said to him, "You've got to be kidding me." That's when he pushed her out of the way, shot all 3 kids in the car. Then he turned to her, and she got the gunshot to her left forearm. She said she then pretended to throw her keys in order to distract this man, and when he was distracted, she pushed him out of the way, got back in the car, and drove like a lunatic to the hospital. Hungry Like the Wolf by Duran Duran was playing in the car. The police immediately placed the children into the custody of the state because they are in the hospital and they need to further investigate this. During the investigation, they go back to the area where Diane said this happened, and they were able to find spent .22 caliber bullet casings in the same area. They found blood splatter all inside the car. But police have to examine all aspects of the crime to look for any further evidence or even any hints to who could have done this. I mean, it's really all they have are the casings and the blood spatter and Diane's story of this bushy-haired man. They talked to people in the nearby area to see if they saw anything or anyone. Police, though, they kind of start to question what Diane tells them. They're curious as to why she would be sightseeing in the dark. That's just not logical for most people to do. They also question why she would stop to help a stranger in the dark on a rural road with her 3 children in the car. They also want to know why her children were fatally shot and almost fatally shot, but her only wound was to her left arm because she was the bigger threat. It would make more sense to take out your bigger threat before taking out the smaller threat. They note that she's right-handed and had been shot at close range in the left forearm. During her police interview at the hospital, they said she was not emotional and did not shed a single tear. The hospital staff was also surprised at how she seemed to show little emotion. They said that when Diane came into Christie's room, Christie's vitals would spike. Diane also made the comment that her new car was really ruined now with blood all in the back of it. One big thing that was very curious is why Diane arrived at the hospital with a towel or some kind of wrap around her gunshot wound, but there was no treatment to the children. So the police get Diane to do a video reenactment of the event 3 days after the crime. And we've talked about that in other cases. That is a common thing. Well, in this video, and you can go online and find clips of this video, before they really get started, but they're already filming, she was sitting in the car kind of primping to make sure she looked good. During the reenactment, she was laughing and she was kind of silly, and it just did not look real well for Diane. Okay.
And as if her behavior is not suspicious enough, Diane then does something that True Crime Out Loud listeners will recognize as a universally bad idea. She begins giving interview after interview after interview with the media. And we see this a lot, and the outcome is almost never good. She denies any involvement in the shooting of her children. She told members of the media that she had been driving back home on back roads when she saw a road that she had never driven down before, and she decided to take it. And this, in fact, was the road where she was flagged down by the bushy-haired man. She also said in one of her media interviews that if she had shot her kids, she would have done a better job of it. And she pointed out that 2 of them survived. And she also stated that why would she drive witnesses to the crime, her kids, to the hospital? She said that if she'd have done it, she would have made sure that the children were dead and then cried crocodile tears. She said she was driving and she remembers Christie reaching her arm forward and was covered in blood, and Christie would be able to get her out of this. Now, at this time, Christie's still unable to speak in the hospital. Danny had been asleep, so he couldn't provide any assistance in the investigation, and he was also 3, the youngest of the children. She goes on to say that when the man shot Christie, the first thing she did was snap back to her childhood and relive that pain of her being sexually abused by her father, and then the bad things that happened to her in her marriage, which that sounds a little odd to me. That would probably not be most people's initial reaction to their child being shot. But she goes on to say that Christie had blood gushing out of her mouth, and what was she supposed to do? And she continues with this almost self-pity trip. She goes on to say that people tell her that she's lucky, but she really wasn't that lucky because she couldn't tie her own shoes for months, and the scar on her arm was going to be there forever. She said that her kids were the lucky ones. If she had been shot like them, they all would have died because she would not have been able to drive them to the hospital. And if you hadn't picked up on this, there's a lot of I and me statements in her interviews, and the more she talked, the worse she looked. And any initial public perception of sympathy for Diane, which she did have some, it quickly changed and went away the way she presented herself in these interviews, and even her own father began to question her story. Ann Yeager did a big interview with Diane and said that after talking to Diane for 2 hours, she noted that Diane did not shed a single tear.
So Diane's making herself look bad with the way she talks and the statements that she's made. But that doesn't mean that she's guilty of anything. So the police continue to investigate. They search for any possible bushy-haired man or anyone who could provide any further information. And they find a witness. This witness says they got behind Diane's small red Nissan that night when she was on her way to the hospital. And remember, Diane said she drove like a lunatic, which we would take to mean that she was driving really fast trying to get there in a hurry. This witness had actually passed Diane's car because she was going between 5 and 10 miles an hour on the way to the hospital. Police believed a .22 caliber Ruger handgun had been used in the shootings. Now, Diane denied to police that she ever owned a .22 caliber Ruger handgun. And they didn't find a .22 caliber Ruger handgun in her home or in her car. What they did find in her home was a .22 caliber rifle with ammo in it. They checked this ammo, and they see that it had been previously ejected from another gun, which left distinct extractor marks on it. And forensically, the extractor marks on the ammo found in her home matched the extractor marks on the casings found at the scene.
So to kind of elaborate a little bit on what Jen means when she says extractor marks, for those who may not know, an extractor is a piece of a semi-automatic weapon, either a handgun or a rifle, that is used to extract, as the name implies, a spent casing from the breech of the weapon. And it's like a little claw. Picture kind of a little claw, and it grabs the rim of a cartridge and pulls back on it so that that cartridge is then ejected from the firearm. So it literally extracts it. And that hook grabbing that casing is what leaves that mark on the casing that can be traced to a particular extractor.
According to Diane's ex-husband and one of Diane's ex-boyfriends, Diane had in fact owned a .22 caliber Ruger handgun. And she had owned this while she was in Arizona. The last time it was seen was in 1983. This .22 caliber handgun was never found. Diane had also said that the suspect was outside the vehicle and he leaned into the car and shot the children through the open driver door because she had gotten out of the car. Well, the police find high-velocity blood spatter on the inside of the car, but also on the outside of the car on the passenger side. And Diane said she never left the area of the driver's door. So how did high-velocity blood spatter get on the passenger side, lower passenger side of this car? The police believe that once Cheryl had been shot, she was able to open the passenger door and possibly fell to the ground. So then Diane reaches across from the driver's side and shot Cheryl a second time. And because Cheryl was outside the vehicle, that passenger door was open, the blood splatter was able to get on the exterior passenger side. Police also locate Diane's diary. And I don't keep a diary. I know a lot of people do. But we hear about a lot of cases where diaries wind up tying things together. Diane had expressed in her writing how much she loved Robert Knickerbocker, who was called Nick. She said in her diary he was supposed to come to Oregon to be with her, and he liked kids, but he did not want kids. Now, they talked to Nick, and he said he did have an affair with Diane, but he never planned on moving to Oregon with her. And in fact, he was overjoyed when she moved so far away. because she just would not leave him alone.
So the police have 2 sets of 22 caliber shells that the extractor marks match. And one of those sets of shells is at the scene, and one of them is in her home, although they're with a weapon that police do not believe is the murder weapon. They also are seeing some kind of sketchy forensic evidence. It's not lining up with Diane's story. There's blood spatter evidence, like Jen mentioned, that isn't matching up. And now the police have developed further motive because Nick didn't want to have kids and she wanted to be with him, and she obviously had kids. So the puzzle pieces are starting to line up for the police, and they are all pointing towards a second interview with Diane. So they bring her in for a follow-up interview, and this time she's not treated like a victim. She's treated like a suspect. Her statements to police and media have been all over the place up to this point, and they've been conflicting with each other, and the police went at her on that fact. And Diane handles this by changing her story again. This time she claims that her and the kids were attacked by 2 suspects who called her by name and threatened her. One man was watching her kids while the other one smoked a cigarette. Police said they didn't believe this new story about 2 assailants, and her entire attitude changed. The detectives noted that when she talked about her children, she was completely devoid of emotion, but would become very boisterous when saying that she had not been the one that shot them. She told them if she had done this, she could have come up with a much more believable story, and in fact became angry and aggressive with the detectives interviewing her, which is a common thing in police interviews. She told them that next time she remembered something about the case, she wouldn't bother telling them, and that they could find the suspect on their own without her help. She said that they could chase their tails for the next 20,000 years if that's what it took. Diane gave off this impression that she felt like she was smarter than police. And the detectives obviously picked up on this air of superiority that she was giving off. Her finale was when she said, "I know who did it. I know his name and saw him shoot the kids. I saw him yank my arm and shoot my arm, and then he told me, now try to get away." And then she tells the police that she's leaving because she knows who did it. And this is where, there's a problem, because if your kids were injured in this way, you would obviously, and you were innocent yourself, you would obviously be willing to help. And here she is telling the police that she knows who did it, but they can chase their tails for 20,000 years. She told the police that she knew his name, but she wouldn't tell them, and then stormed out of the interview room. And you might think that they jumped up and stopped her and arrested her, but they didn't, because they needed to get everything lined up, and they were waiting to see if Christie was going to wake up and eventually be able to talk. And sometimes the police will do that. If they feel like they have a good sense of where this person's going to be, and they don't consider them much of a flight risk, and they want to get a strong case together before they make an actual arrest.
Yeah, it's about what you can prove, not about what you know. So they have to get the proof of what they feel like they know. So in February of 1989, Diane was arrested for murder and attempted murder of her children. And this is 9 months after the crime occurred. Now, Diane loved being in the spotlight, even after she was arrested. She just wanted to be seen. She was still giving these media interviews. And the case comes to trial. And as if Diane Downs could not be any more extra than she has already been, she shows up to court pregnant. Very pregnant. 8 months pregnant. So remember, Christie had a stroke, and initially she couldn't talk. Once Christie was finally able to speak again, she was afraid to talk. So they had her work with a therapist over these many, many months. The therapist would have her write down who had shot her, and then she would let Christie put it in an envelope, and then they would immediately burn it. And they did this over and over and over again, until finally it got to the point Christie was ready to reveal that name she had been writing down all this time. And the name on that paper was her mom. Although they are hesitant about bringing a child who is now 9 years old to court to testify, and who has had a stroke and is going to have some lifelong disabilities due to this, They do bring Christie to court. When the prosecutor asked Christie who shot her, she replied, "My mom." She said she saw her mom go to the trunk of the car and get something out. She then came back to the driver's side of the car, knelt on the driver's seat, and shot all 3 of her children. Christie said she first shot Cheryl, then Danny, and then Christie, and then she shot herself. When asked how she knew it was her mom that had shot Cheryl, and remember Cheryl is the child that died, Christie replied with, "I watched." Remember we told you Hungry Like the Wolf had been playing in the car during the crimes? So this song was played in court. And when they play it, Diane swayed and she tapped her feet and moved her body to the beat of the music. Hospital staff testified that when Diane arrived to the hospital, the first person she called was Nick. And this is before she even asked about her kids. They present the ballistics on the casings from the scene and the ammo at her home. Like I said, they never found a murder weapon, even when they had divers go into the Mohawk River, which was adjacent to the crime scene. Prosecutor Hughie believed that she had thrown the gun in the Mohawk River, but because of such swift currents, it was washed away and hard to find. Now, Diane's defense: the ballistics were planted, and Christie had been coerced to point the finger at Diane. They point to a gunshot residue test that had been done at the hospital, and it was negative. Diane did not have gunshot residue on her hands.
A notoriously unreliable test anyway.
Well, also, she could have easily washed her hands, and in fact, they had a witness that had seen her in the restroom and heard water running. So the trial lasts about 6 weeks, and they present over 500 pieces of evidence. Now, Diane had been charged on 5 counts. 1 count of aggravated murder for Cheryl, 2 counts of attempted murder for Christie and Danny, and 2 counts of assault on Christie and Danny. And Diane was found guilty on all counts. 10 days after she is found guilty, Diane gives birth to a baby girl who is immediately placed with a family and adopted. Now, Diane had named this baby girl Amy Elizabeth, but her adoptive parents named her Rebecca Babcock, and we're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. Diane was sentenced to life plus 50 years for her crimes.
So I'm sure everyone's wondering, what's up with showing up to court pregnant? And Diane explains this to the media. She said that she missed her kids so badly that she got pregnant. She made the statement that you can't replace children, but you can replace the effect that they give you. Love, satisfaction, stability, and she wouldn't be alone. She also pointed out that children are very easy to conceive. She said that she seduced a man on her mail route, and she knew her cycle so well that she knew what day she would need to have sex with him to get pregnant. So she showed up to his home with liquor and marijuana, and that's how it happened. That's how she explained it. Now, as if this were any big shock, her mental health is called into question, and Dr. Polly Jameson gave Diane the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and she was classified as a deviant sociopath with histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. And these disorders manifest themselves in behaviors such as manipulation, aggression, lack of empathy, lack of conscience, and the person can often be charming and have an overwhelming desire to be noticed, often behave dramatically or inappropriately to get attention. They demonstrate no regard for right or wrong. They carry themselves with an arrogance and sense of superiority. They engage in risky behavior and have an inflated sense of their own importance. They're plagued with troubled relationships, fragile self-esteem, and a sense of entitlement. And that reads like a checklist of who Diane Downs is.
But it's not over. So Diane had been in jail for 3 years in 1987 when she escaped from the prison in Oregon. Police received tips from all over the U.S., and they did not think they were going to be able to locate Diane. But they searched her cell, and they found a notepad. but there was nothing written on the notepad. But one person had a keen eye and noticed there were indentations from where someone had written on the page before and torn it out. You know how if you write, you can see sometimes the imprint from what was written before? Well, they analyze it, and on it they were able to see a map from the prison to a house with a specific address on it. So it took authorities about 10 days to track her down, and she was still close to the prison where she was staying with another inmate's husband. So she was transferred to a more secure prison in New Jersey, and then she ended up in a prison in California, which is not normal when you're convicted of a state crime, but due to her notoriety and her attention-seeking behavior and her escape, they made arrangements with California, and that's where she ended up. Now, she's been denied parole, and she currently still sits in prison at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California, and is maintaining her innocence. She had parole hearings in 2008 and 2010, like I said, both denied. And during these parole hearings, she blamed the crimes on corrupt cops, motorcycle gangs, and or an international spy ring. She said if released, she would live in Denison, Texas, near her parents, and she would not have a problem finding work because any number of attorneys would hire her as an investigator or a clerk because she knows things about the psyche of a prisoner. She told the parole board they had seen her IQ, and they knew she was only 3 points shy of genius. At the hearing, she also presented this book, which had been given to her by another inmate about 4 days before her hearing. Diane showed this book and said it contained information about the murder of her uncle that was connected to the State Department. She also said she had been married to a man since 1981 who was a federal agent, but she wouldn't allow him to come to the prison to visit because of the media. But then she said this husband had been murdered in 2002. She said she still considers herself married to him, but if she got out, she would marry a man she had met through letter writing, but she refused to give his name. This book also had information about this husband who had been a federal agent and pictures. Now, the name of this book was All Night, All Day, Angels Watching Over With Me. And what this book is about is encounters with angels. But her book had been altered to show photos and some other things that were not normal to the book. So she's basically still trying to manipulate and outsmart everybody. She thinks everybody's dumber than her. She said she also rejected what the psychiatrists had to say about her in their reports. But her story about what happened has continually changed and evolved. She even described a new shooter and said his motive was to put her in prison. She told the parole board that the reason she talks about her children in an emotionless manner is because she lives with it every day and she can't talk about them. She has to internalize it, and it is her private grief.
So what happened to Christie and Danny after the trial and everything? Well, the lead prosecutor in the case against Diane adopted both Christie and Danny. Christie had some long-term effects from the crime, including impaired speech and impaired use of one arm, and Danny was wheelchair-bound. The baby, Amy Elizabeth, who the adopted parents ended up naming Becky Babcock, grew up to become a behavioral health coordinator for children in Salem, Oregon. Christie and Danny have chosen to remain out of the spotlight, but Becky did give an interview about finding out that Diane Downs was her birth mother. She said that it terrified her and made her fearful that she would become a monster. She felt like the mental health aspect might have a hereditary component. When she became an adult, she began to reach out to Diane and write one another. And Becky said that at first, this was a positive interaction with her mother, but then it became kind of strange. She said that Diane wrote her a 12-page letter about conspiracy theories and people watching her and about how she's innocent. And she even accused Becky of being part of the conspiracy. Becky decided at this point that it was time to not have any further contact with Diane, and she told her that. Diane wrote a letter to the parole board and told them that Becky is not her daughter, but had approached her about maternity. and Diane refused her request for DNA confirmation. Now, none of this was true. And she said that Becky was conceived by artificial insemination. And this is just keeping with her stories changing and just being all over the place, obvious mental health issues. Her latest version of events is that she and the kids were at home watching TV when someone called her to come pick up pictures for her boyfriend, who claimed to be an FBI agent. She said that she received the call about 9:15, so she put the kids in the car and went to get the pictures. And this is when the attack happened. On the road to get those pictures for her FBI boyfriend is when she was flagged down and the kids were shot. So the story continues to change, and it has all the hallmarks of what we see with mental health issues. This over focus on government and conspiracies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and we saw that in the Eileen Warnos case. The longer she stayed in jail, the more it became a government conspiracy against her. But this case, one I've known about most of my life, adult life anyway, and people remember Susan Smith because Susan Smith, same kind of situation. She was married, she had 2 children, had a love affair or an infatuation with a guy. He didn't want children. She kills her children. She blames it on a man. But her children, she had drowned them in the car. And a lot of people know about that case because I think it's in more recent times. That was in the 90s, and this was back in the 80s. But Diane Downs was the Susan Smith of the 80s, except she wasn't successful in killing all 3 children. Luckily, she was unsuccessful, and 2 of those children survived.
I mean, what do you think about, so Susan Smith she made up a story. Right. She said that an African-American male carjacked her with her kids in the car. And so she comes up with a cover story. And we know after the investigation and everything that was, again, like you pointed out, an effort for her to be with another person who didn't want kids. Right.
Right.
Okay. And we see this same thing with Diane Downs, although there's this mental health component, this conspiracy theory, weird stuff that really wasn't present in the Susan Smith case. I mean, obviously you have to have mental health issues to murder your child, but this conspiracy theory kind of thing.
But I don't think that came until later. I mean, she's been in prison since the 80s, and this was 2008 and 2010 when she was presenting to the parole board. So I think being in prison contributes. If you have mental health, and you'll hear people say all the time, oh, they need to be in a mental health facility and not in prison. Well, as bad as it is, our prisons are full of people with mental health issues. That's how they wind up there, is because of their issues. And I think being in prison and being in a little bit of isolation compared to what you're used to, all that contributes to exacerbating any mental health issues you're going to have. So I think that came later. I don't think that conspiracy and blaming it on everybody else came in until later.
Well, and I mean, I agree. There is certainly a large number of the prison population that suffers with mental health issues. But in cases like this, where a crime this severe is committed, I mean, I think the corrections community has to focus on giving those people mental health treatment while in prison. They need to be locked up. And I think people that commit crimes like this need to be locked up in a prison. Obviously, with her escape history, they need to be locked up in a prison rather than a mental institution. And it's just a tough situation for corrections personnel because, like you pointed out, I mean, the isolation and the time institutionalized can exacerbate those mental health problems. This case also reminds me of the case that we did earlier about the guy who killed
Chris Watts.
I don't do good with names, but again, here's another case of a guy who had a girlfriend, needed to get rid of wife and kids so that he could have the girlfriend. It's like these cases where people are killing their kids to be in a relationship with another person, just
I know, and
it's inconceivable.
Yeah, and it could have been as simple as her saying, okay, I don't want my kids anymore, giving them to her parents or her husband, but that would be admitting defeat. And as we saw in what they diagnosed in her mental health, that self-esteem is a real problem, and she wouldn't want to look bad. I'll also say I saw where people said, well, why didn't Steve Downs, the father, take these children, Christie and Danny? Well, first of all, Danny wasn't his biological child. But also, he was not capable of taking care of two children on his own that were going to have these serious physical ailments and also the traumatic issue they had already been through of trying to be killed by one parent. So I think that's how it wound up, and I think he agreed it was best that the prosecutor, Hughie, and his wife adopt these children.
Sure, because I'm sure that these children not only needed physical help because of lasting effects, but need mental health help, for the rest of their lives. What a traumatic event.
Yeah, and I read a lot on Becky Babcock. If you search her name, it'll pull up some of the interviews that she's done. You can watch it or read it in written form. But she was a teenager when she discovered Diane Downs and watched the movie Small Sacrifices, which is based on the book by Ann Rule. And we all know who Ann Rule is if we're in the true crime community. She's a true crime writer. And she saw this movie and she said she was traumatized and she went down a bad path of her own. And the reason she decided to reach out to Diane is Becky had become an adult and she was having a child and she gave that child up for adoption. I mean, she knew Diane had given her up for adoption. So she wanted that connection with somebody who had been there and knowing that this was her mother and maybe there was more to it than her just trying to kill her children. And I guess Becky discovered otherwise. But it sounds like she's done wonderful things with her life, and being involved in the mental health community is always a positive thing.
Yes, certainly. And I'm glad that Christie and Danny obviously survived the incident, and hopefully they've, gone on to lead productive lives. And although I'm sure they've dealt with many issues, I mean, they're survivors, and that's certainly commendable.
Oh, yeah. And I will tell you one more thing. I read that Steve Downs wanted Diane to get executed. He wanted her dead. That didn't happen in this case, but I mean, there's the toss up between, is death really death because you're going to sit there a long time anyway? Is life in prison worse than death because you're having to face what you did every day? But if you don't have a guilty conscience, are you really facing anything every day other than your isolation? Thank you again to Kathleen for recommending this case. And I'd actually researched it a while back. So when she recommended it, I was like, oh, let me go to my file and get Diane Downs, because like I said, I've known about this case most of my adult life. And that's the case. I mean, you can research more on your own and see if you have an opinion other than Diane Downs did it, because there are people who share the opinion that it wasn't Diane and her mental health just made her look like she was guilty.
We hope you enjoyed this week's case, and as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.